Entity Framework Database First Development. There are two ways to implement Entity Framework in your applications, regardless if it's a Blazor server app or web API or even a console app. With the code-first approach, you create your model classes that represent the tables in the database and generate a new database from that. With the database-first approach, you can use an existing database and generate your model classes from the tables in the database. In this video, we'll look at the database-first approach, but there's a link in the description below to the video on code-first development. We start with an existing database. Here in our SQL Express server, we have a database called DB Library with two tables, authors and books. They have a one-to-many relationship. The books table have a foreign key called author ID. This is the database we'll be scaffolding in our C# project. For our demonstration, we'll be using a web API project, but you can do Entity Framework database first development in other projects, like Blazor Server or even a console app. We'll use .NET 9, and yes, we're going to use controllers. First, of course, we need the Entity Framework packages and tools. You could install these packages from the PM console if you prefer, or if you intend to write scripts, but we'll just use the IDE's provided interface. Right-click your project and select Manage New Get Packages. Go to the Browse tab and search for Entity Framework. The first package is the Microsoft Entity Framework Core. This is the foundation package for Entity Framework. Ensure that you select a version that corresponds to your project's framework. The second package is Entity Framework Core.Tools. This contains the database scaffolding tools we'll be using a bit later. Then the last package is for the database server provider we'll be using. In our case, it's SQL Server, but there are others like SQLite, MySQL, Progress, etc. With the Entity Framework packages installed, we also need a connection string to our database. In the appsettings.json file, we add a connection strings section and added a connection string to our DB library database. Of course, this would be different from your own environment, but for our database, we specify the local SQL Express server, the database name, trusted connection is true, and trust server certificate is true. We're ready to scaffold our data context and models from the database. Open your Package Manager console. We're going to use the Scaffold DB Context tool from the Entity Framework Tools package. This is essentially a code writer. It will read your database schema and generate model classes from the tables as well as a data context class. Let's look at this command step by step. The first argument is your connection string. It says we're using a named connection string called DB library connection. The second argument tells it what data server provider we're using. Then the third and fourth arguments tell it where to generate the models and DB context class. It will create the folders, models, and data for us. If all goes well, the folders and classes are generated. Some of the things that could go wrong is there could be a typo in the command, or the connection string in your app settings file is not correct, or the database server is not available. The error it shows might not always be obvious. Otherwise, with your data context class scaffolded, you need to add the service to your program.cs file. Let's have a closer look at what was scaffolded. You'll notice that the Scaffold tool generates partial classes. It does this to allow regeneration without overwriting manual changes. If you'd rather have full control, you can remove the partial keyword and partial properties. For the author model, it generated a virtual I collection for its relationship to books. Of course, this is a virtual property and is not automatically populated. It uses deferred execution or lazy loading. It will only populate it when you actually access the property. The book model also has a virtual property that holds an author object. Again, it will only retrieve the data once you try to access this property. The generated data context class has two constructors and the two DB sets for the models. Then an onConfiguring method to set the options to use SQL Server and retrieve the connection string. Then, on model creation, sets up some column properties and establishes the relationship, foreign key, and constraints for the tables. To test this, let's add a controller. We'll add an empty API controller and call it Authors Controller. In the controller, we need to inject the data context. Now you can do it the traditional way of creating a constructor to take your DB context object and assign it to a local variable. Or you can use the shortcut version and pass it as an argument to the class name. The result is the same. Create a HTTP GET endpoint to retrieve all the authors. Here we use the context to access the authors DB set and return it as a list. To test the endpoint, either open the .http in the Solution Explorer and edit it, or go to View Other Windows and Endpoint Explorer. The Endpoint Explorer will list all the endpoints in your project. Right-click the Get Authors endpoint and select Generate Request. The HTTP file is opened and the GET request is added. Before sending the request, make sure your API is running, of course. Click Send Request and we get the response back from our controller endpoint. In this case, we only have one author in the database. Let's try another endpoint, this time to retrieve a book by ID. We'll just quickly create it here in the author's controller instead of creating a separate controller for books. We'll give the endpoint a name and ID parameter. It uses the booksDB set to find a book whose primary key matches the ID argument. Back in our Endpoints Explorer, we right-click and generate the request for this endpoint. Then, give the ID parameter a value and send the request. The book is returned, but the author property is null. Let's change our endpoint to include the author. In the endpoint, use the link method include to include the author. Follow this with the first or default method to specify the book ID. However, back in our HTTP file, when we send the request again, we get some kind of JSON serialization cycle issue. This happens because every time we try to include the author, JSON also tries to retrieve a collection of books for that author, and each book tries to get its author again, all in a vicious, endless cycle. To fix this, we annotate the collection property in author with JSON ignore. Now when we try the endpoint again, we get the book with its author object. Just for interest's sake, let's look at using the data context from a service's point of view. Probably most of the time, you would inject a service into your controller instead of the actual data context. Services make things more manageable and maintainable, especially when adding business logic, extensive validations, or creating DTOs from multiple tables. This spares your controller endpoints from repeating code and keeps them minimalistic. We'll add a class called Book Services. Inside the Book Service class, we can let IntelliSense drum out the CRUD methods for us. This class needs to inherit from an interface class that will inject into the controller. Before we create the interface class, we update the getBooksById method to include the author. Right? Let's add the interface class. And let IntelliSense generate the method signatures from the service class. If we want to inject this interface into our controller, we need to register the service in our program CS file. With that in place, we create an empty API controller called Books Controller. Now, instead of injecting the data context class, we inject the service and we call the service method to get a book by ID. Our Endpoints Explorer picked up the new endpoint, so we can just right-click it and select Generate Request. When we run and send the request, we get the expected book with its author. Thank you for watching our video. For more tutorials on C#, hit subscribe and click the reminder. Give us a like so the video can be visible to more people.